Some people think the ugliest building on your property is the easiest one to destroy. They only realize what it was worth after the water stops flowing. The first thing I heard that Tuesday morning wasn't birds or the steady hum of my well pump. It was the deep metallic growl of a bulldozer climbing the gravel road toward my property before the sun had fully burned the mist off the fields. Diesel fumes drifted through the open kitchen window, mixing with the smell of fresh coffee, and something in my gut told me this wasn't another empty HOA threat. By the time I stepped onto my porch, the machine's steel tracks were already pressing fresh marks into the dirt my father had walked for nearly 40 years. Standing beside it, dressed in a spotless cream-colored blazer that somehow never seemed to collect dust, was Victoria Holloway, president of the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, holding a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. She pointed toward my old wooden well shed with a smile that looked more satisfied than polite. The little building wasn't much to look at. Weathered cedar boards, a faded green metal roof, white paint peeling from the trim after decades of Texas summers. Most people drove past without giving it a second glance. To Victoria, it was an eyesore dragging down property values. To me, it was the last thing my father built with his own hands before cancer stole the strength from them. I started walking toward the crew, but before I could say a word, the bulldozer eased forward. The steel blade touched the front wall with a dull crack. Old lumber splintered, glass shattered. A cloud of dry cedar dust rolled into the morning air carrying that unmistakable smell of old wood, rust, and damp earth. Victoria folded her arms and nodded with quiet approval, convinced she'd just improved the neighborhood. Then everything became strangely quiet. The familiar vibration beneath my boots disappeared. The soft mechanical pulse that had echoed underground every morning for as long as I could remember simply stopped. Even the birds seemed to hesitate. I looked toward the pressure gauge mounted beside the remaining section of concrete foundation. The needle dropped. 40 pounds. 30. 15. Then 0. Less than 10 seconds later, my phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. Messages poured in faster than I could read them. No water. Is your system down? Fire hydrants aren't working. My shower stopped. What's happening? Somewhere beyond the trees, I heard another sound replacing the steady rhythm of flowing water. Car doors slamming. Neighbors calling across driveways. Confused voices growing louder by the second. Victoria glanced at her own phone, her confident smile beginning to fade as notifications lit up her screen one after another. She looked back at the broken shed, then at me expecting panic, excuses, maybe even anger. Instead, I simply slipped my hands into my pockets and watched the dust settle. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 43 years old, and I'm a civil engineer. That little weather-beaten shed they had just bulldozed wasn't an abandoned storage shack. It was the quiet heart of the only emergency groundwater distribution system serving more than 400 homes. And the people celebrating its destruction hadn't yet realized they had just shut off their own water. 18 years before that bulldozer ever rolled onto my property, my father handed me a pipe wrench so worn smooth that the handle almost felt polished. He rested one hand on the old pressure tank and told me something I never forgot. People only notice water when it disappears. At the time, I thought he was talking about plumbing. Years later, I realized he was talking about responsibility. I grew up on those 27 acres just outside Cedar Ridge long before the subdivision existed. Back then, the land was open pasture dotted with live oak trees, and our well supplied not only our house but several neighboring ranches during dry summers. When the county approved a large residential development years later, engineers discovered the underground aquifer beneath our property produced cleaner, more reliable groundwater than drilling dozens of individual wells across the area. Rather than build an expensive municipal pumping station, the county reached an agreement with my father. He retained ownership of the land, while a recorded utility easement allowed the community to connect to a centralized distribution system hidden beneath our property. It saved taxpayers millions of dollars, protected the aquifer from overdevelopment, and quietly became one of the smartest infrastructure projects in the county. After graduating with a civil engineering degree from Texas A&M University, I spent nearly 2 decades designing water systems, drainage improvements, and emergency infrastructure across the state. Every permit, inspection, maintenance log, and pressure test for our system ended up neatly organized inside gray filing cabinets in my workshop. My father believed paperwork mattered just as much as concrete because good engineering was only as strong as the records behind it. When he passed away, I inherited more than land. I inherited a promise that the people depending on this well would never have to think about it. That was the whole point. Reliable infrastructure is supposed to disappear into everyday life. Nobody wakes up grateful that water comes out of the faucet until the morning it does not. The weathered little shed became the joke of the neighborhood as newer homes appeared with decorative stone entrances, manicured flower beds, and matching mailboxes. Neighbors admired ornamental fountains without realizing every drop flowing through them first passed beneath that faded green roof. Inside the building were not treasures or forgotten junk, but pressure regulators, emergency shutoff valves, electrical controls, backup switches, and monitoring equipment that I personally inspected every Saturday morning. I knew every bolt, every gauge, every vibration of the pumps beneath the concrete floor. Even blindfolded, I could have walked through that shed by memory alone. The smell of machine oil, cool groundwater, and old cedar always reminded me of my father standing beside me with grease on his hands and quiet confidence in his voice. That was why I never replaced the building with something prettier. His appearance had never been the important part. His job was. While other people saw faded paint and warped boards, I saw decades of uninterrupted service, thousands of maintenance hours, and a system that had faithfully delivered clean water to hundreds of families without asking for recognition. Unfortunately, there was one person who had spent months looking at that little building without ever seeing what it truly was. Victoria Holloway had a talent for making control sound like kindness. She was 52 years old, a successful real estate agent, and the kind of person who never raised her voice because she never believed she had to. She drove a pearl white luxury sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly polished, wore expensive perfume that lingered several seconds after she walked away, and treated every monthly homeowners association meeting like a corporate board meeting where only one opinion mattered. New families moving into Cedar Ridge usually thought she was friendly during the first week. By the second month, they understood the difference between friendly and calculating. Every mailbox had to match. Every lawn had to stay within the approved height. Holiday decorations came down exactly when her calendar said they should. If someone questioned a rule, she would smile, quote a paragraph from the neighborhood handbook, and remind them that community standards protected property values. Most people simply nodded because arguing with Victoria usually meant receiving another inspection notice a few days later. The strange thing was that my property technically sat outside the subdivision boundary. The homeowners association could not regulate my land the way it regulated theirs, but that never seemed to stop her from trying. She often stood near the fence line with visiting buyers, pointing toward my well shed while talking about future neighborhood improvements. More than once I overheard her describe it as an unfortunate visual distraction from otherwise beautiful homes. She never once asked what the building actually did. She only judged what it looked like from the road. Our first real conversation happened nearly 8 months before everything unraveled. I was replacing an aging pressure sensor inside the shed when she walked across the grass carrying a clipboard. The late afternoon sun reflected off her sunglasses as she stopped a few feet away and looked at the building with obvious disappointment. She asked why I refused to replace what she called that old shack. I explained, politely, that it was an active utility structure containing critical equipment and that cosmetic changes had to be planned carefully around operational requirements. She barely listened. Instead, she suggested wrapping the entire building with decorative stone veneer, adding flower beds, and painting the roof to better match the neighborhood entrance. I thanked her for the suggestion and told her the system had functioned reliably for decades exactly as designed. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that meant the conversation was not actually over. During the months that followed, certified letters started arriving with surprising regularity. One claimed the structure negatively affected neighborhood appearance. Another suggested loose boards presented a safety concern despite the locked gate and posted warning signs. A third encouraged voluntary removal in exchange for what the association called beautification assistance. I answered every letter the same way. I attached photographs, engineering documentation, maintenance records, and copies of the recorded utility easement filed with the county years earlier. Facts, permits, and documentation always seemed stronger to me than opinions. Apparently, Victoria believed appearances were stronger than facts. Looking back now, I realized she had never been trying to understand that little building. She had already decided what story it represented, and in her mind, removing it was simply another improvement waiting to happen. The letters eventually stopped sounding polite and started sounding confident. One Monday morning, I opened my mailbox to find a thick certified envelope stamped with the Homeowners Association logo. Inside was a formal notice declaring that my structure violated updated community appearance standards and would be subject to corrective action if I failed to remove it within 30 days. I read every page twice, more impressed by the formatting than the legal reasoning. The document cited landscaping rules, architectural harmony, and neighborhood aesthetics, but not a single sentence acknowledged the recorded utility easement or the county infrastructure agreement attached to every response I had already sent. That afternoon, I drove to the association office carrying a neatly organized binder. Every permit was tabbed. Every inspection report was dated. Every engineering drawing was sealed by licensed professionals. I laid the binder on the conference table and calmly walked Victoria through the entire history of the system, explaining how the distribution manifold beneath the shed balanced water pressure across the subdivision, and how even routine maintenance required uninterrupted access to the equipment inside. She barely glanced at the drawings before sliding them back toward me. She said homeowners cared about what they could see, not pipes buried underground. Then she added that outdated buildings had no place in a modern community. Her words were calm, but they carried the certainty of someone who had already made up her mind. I reminded her that the Homeowners Association had no ownership interest in the utility equipment and that any modification would require county approval. She smiled and replied that appearances could not wait forever. Over the next several weeks, contractors began appearing near the subdivision entrance measuring sidewalks, planting decorative shrubs, and replacing street signs with polished stone monuments. Every improvement seemed designed to create a picture-perfect neighborhood brochure. At the same time, more notices appeared in my mailbox requesting voluntary cooperation with what they called the Beautification Initiative. I answered every one with the same professionalism. Copies of permits, copies of easement records, copies of maintenance logs. I even included photographs showing recent inspections inside the building, where the pressure gauges, backup switches, and emergency shutoff valves continued operating exactly as designed. My responses grew thicker while theirs grew shorter. Finally, a county inspector I had worked with years earlier stopped by after hearing rumors about the dispute. We walked through the shed together while the steady hum of the pumps echoed beneath the concrete floor. He checked the equipment, reviewed my maintenance records, and nodded with quiet approval before reminding me to keep documenting everything. His advice was simple. Facts have a way of surviving longer than opinions. I took that seriously. I photographed the building every weekend. I saved every letter, every email, and every voicemail. Security cameras remained active around the clock. Looking back, I realized I was preparing evidence without knowing exactly when I would need it. Then, late one Friday afternoon, a neighbor quietly mentioned seeing heavy construction equipment parked at a contractor's yard only a few miles away. He laughed and said he had heard the association was finally going to clean up the last ugly structure near the entrance. I thanked him, closed the gate behind me, and looked once more at the faded green roof catching the evening sunlight. Something told me the next week was going to change far more than the view from the road. Monday arrived with the kind of clear blue Texas sky that usually promised an ordinary day. Instead, it delivered silence where there should have been the steady heartbeat of flowing water. As the pressure gauge settled at 0, my phone refused to stop vibrating. The first call came from a young mother asking why every faucet in her kitchen had gone dry. The second came from an elderly couple wondering if the city was repairing a water main. By the fifth call, I no longer needed to answer because I already knew exactly what every voice on the other end was about to ask. Across the subdivision, garage doors rolled open one after another. Neighbors stepped into their driveways carrying empty coffee mugs, confused expressions replacing the easy routine that usually defined weekday mornings. Lawn sprinklers remained motionless. Decorative fountains stood perfectly still. Even the gentle hiss from irrigation systems had disappeared. The neighborhood sounded strangely hollow without the constant background rhythm of moving water. Then the first fire engine arrived. Its lights flashed quietly as firefighters checked a nearby hydrant. I watched one of them connect a pressure gauge before slowly shaking his head toward the captain. Another emergency vehicle pulled in behind them, followed by a county utility truck. Victoria stood near the broken remains of the shed, still clutching her clipboard, but the confidence that had carried her through every homeowners association meeting was beginning to disappear. She walked toward one of the utility workers and pointed toward the demolished structure, as if it were simply another construction project that had taken an unexpected turn. The technician barely looked at her. Instead, he crouched beside the exposed concrete foundation where sections of carefully labeled pipe now lay uncovered beneath splintered cedar boards. His expression changed immediately. He picked up his radio and quietly requested additional personnel. Within minutes, more county trucks began arriving from different directions. Survey flags appeared around the site. Bright orange cones surrounded the damaged equipment. Someone stretched yellow safety tape across the driveway, not because the area was dangerous to people walking by, but because every inch of disturbed ground had suddenly become important evidence. I remained exactly where I had been since the bulldozer stopped moving. There was nothing for me to argue about anymore. The facts were already speaking louder than I ever could. Victoria finally turned toward me and asked why I had not warned anyone this building mattered. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I reminded her about every certified letter, every engineering report, every maintenance record, every county easement, every inspection, every meeting, and every conversation she had dismissed because Weatheredwood did not match her vision of a beautiful neighborhood. Her eyes drifted toward the stack of broken lumber as though she were seeing it for the first time. Around us, frustrated homeowners gathered in growing numbers, watching county officials carefully examine pipes, valves, and electrical conduits that had quietly served them for years without asking for attention. The little building everyone had overlooked had finally become the most important place in the entire subdivision. But by then, the lesson had already become painfully clear. Infrastructure does not stop being essential simply because someone decides it is unattractive. About 30 minutes after the county crews arrived, a white pickup bearing the seal of the County Water Authority rolled slowly through the temporary barricades. I recognized the driver before he even stepped out. Daniel Mercer had spent almost 25 years overseeing public water infrastructure throughout the county, and I had worked alongside him on more than one emergency project after severe storms. He looked at the shattered remains of the shed without saying a word. Then he walked straight past Victoria, knelt beside the exposed manifold, brushed loose cedar splinters away from a brass identification plate, and quietly exhaled. The expression on his face told me he already understood the full scope of what had happened. One of the utility inspectors handed him a clipboard containing photographs taken only minutes earlier. Daniel flipped through them, then looked toward me. "Please tell me the backup controls were not inside." I shook my head once. "Everything except the remote monitoring unit." He closed his eyes for a brief second before turning toward the growing crowd. By then nearly 50 homeowners had gathered near the road, whispering to one another while county workers continued documenting every damaged connection. Victoria stepped forward and attempted to explain that the Homeowners Association had merely removed an abandoned storage building as part of a beautification effort. Daniel interrupted her before she finished the sentence. He pointed toward the exposed piping beneath the broken concrete slab and spoke in the calm, measured voice of someone who had repeated technical facts thousands of times during his career. That was not a storage building. It was the primary control station regulating pressure, emergency isolation, and groundwater distribution for the entire Cedar Ridge service area. Several people in the crowd looked confused, so he continued. He explained that while the subdivision had expanded over the years, the county intentionally left the original pumping and control infrastructure on my property because relocating it would have required millions of dollars in excavation, environmental review, and reconstruction. Instead, A permanent recorded utility easement had been established decades earlier, giving the county legal access to maintain the equipment while ownership of the land remained with my family. Every permit, inspection, and maintenance agreement had been renewed exactly as required. The weathered appearance of the shed had never changed its legal status. It remained an active public utility facility protected under county infrastructure regulations. One homeowner raised his hand and quietly asked the question everyone else seemed afraid to say out loud. "Does that mean our water comes from here?" Daniel nodded without hesitation. Every kitchen faucet, every shower, every irrigation line, every fire hydrant in this subdivision depends on the system that was operating inside this structure. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument ever could. I watched people slowly turn toward the broken pile of lumber with completely different eyes than they had only an hour earlier. They no longer saw peeling paint or an aging roof. They saw the quiet machine that had supported their daily lives without ever asking for recognition. Victoria looked from Daniel to me and then back toward the exposed manifold, searching for something to say that might somehow change what everyone had just learned. There was nothing left to debate. The truth had been sitting beneath that little building for decades. It simply took one irreversible mistake for an entire neighborhood to finally notice it. Once the initial shock settled into an uneasy silence, the site transformed from a construction zone into something far more methodical. County investigators arrived carrying cameras instead of shovels. Every damaged valve, every severed conduit, every broken electrical enclosure received its own evidence marker. The rhythmic clicking of camera shutters replaced the sound of heavy equipment, while survey crews stretched measuring tapes across the disturbed ground with the same precision I had used on engineering projects for years. Nobody was interested in assigning blame through loud arguments anymore. They were interested in documenting facts. Daniel Mercer asked me to retrieve every maintenance record I had referenced during the past several months. I walked into my workshop, opened the gray filing cabinet my father had bought decades earlier, and carried out binders filled with inspection reports, engineering drawings, pressure logs, utility agreements, and photographs dating back years. The familiar scent of aging paper and machine oil followed me as I placed the binders across the folding table the county had set up beside the driveway. One by one, the investigators compared the documents with the exposed infrastructure beneath the shattered foundation. Every serial number matched. Every maintenance entry aligned with the installed equipment. Every permit referenced the exact location where the damaged control station had stood only hours before. Daniel quietly nodded after reviewing the final inspection report and thanked me for keeping such detailed records. He said documentation like this often determined whether complex infrastructure disputes lasted weeks or years. Across the road, the atmosphere had changed completely. Homeowners who had once complimented the association on improving neighborhood appearance were now standing in small groups reading copies of the easement records that county staff had printed from public archives. Several recognized my name on documents recorded long before many of them had even purchased their homes. A retired teacher approached me with an embarrassed expression and admitted she had signed an online petition supporting removal of the old shed because she believed it had been abandoned. I simply told her she had acted on the information she had been given. There was no benefit in holding grudges when the paperwork already spoke for itself. Victoria remained unusually quiet throughout the afternoon. The confident posture that had always defined her seemed to disappear each time another official arrived. Representatives from the county attorney's office spoke privately with investigators. The utility authority requested copies of every notice the homeowners association had ever sent regarding the structure. Even the contractor who supplied the bulldozer spent nearly an hour reviewing work authorization documents with county personnel before leaving without saying much at all. As the sun slowly drifted lower across the Texas sky, emergency repair crews began discussing temporary bypass options that might restore limited service, while a permanent solution could be designed. Listening to them felt strangely familiar because they were solving the exact kind of engineering problem I had spent my career preparing for. Daniel eventually walked over and quietly asked if I would assist the county with developing the recovery plan since nobody knew the system better than I did. I looked once more at the broken cedar boards scattered across the ground where my father and I had spent so many weekends maintaining equipment that most people never knew existed. Then I nodded. The structure had been destroyed, but the knowledge behind it had not, and that was the one thing no bulldozer could ever tear down. The next 72 hours became a masterclass in how quietly the law can move when the facts are undeniable. Temporary pumps restored limited service to the subdivision, while county engineers designed a safe bypass around the damaged control station. The steady hum of portable generators replaced the familiar rhythm of the original system, and long hoses stretched across the grass where decorative flower beds had stood untouched only days before. Every resident could now see the infrastructure they had never noticed before. It was no longer hidden beneath weathered cedar boards. It was spread across the neighborhood in plain sight, reminding everyone how much work it took to deliver something as simple as a glass of clean water. Meanwhile, the investigation continued with remarkable speed. The county attorney's office confirmed that the utility easement had been properly recorded decades earlier and remained fully enforceable. The demolition authorization signed by the Homeowners Association contained no county approval, no utility clearance, and no verification that the structure had been evaluated by qualified personnel before removal. Investigators compared my correspondence with the association's internal meeting minutes, and the timeline became impossible to ignore. Every engineering report I had submitted had been received. Every warning had been documented. Every explanation had been preserved. The decision to proceed had not been based on missing information. It had been based on ignoring it. Insurance representatives spent an entire afternoon walking the site with clipboards and cameras. They examined damaged equipment, reviewed maintenance records, and photographed the exposed distribution network from every angle. One adjuster quietly admitted he had never seen documentation this complete for a privately owned utility installation. My father would have smiled if he had heard that. He always believed good records protected honest work long after memories faded. Homeowners who had once applauded beautification projects began asking different questions during the emergency community meeting held later that week. They wanted to know why independent engineering advice had never been requested. They wanted to know why county records had not been reviewed before authorizing demolition. Most importantly, they wanted to know why repeated warnings from the owner of the infrastructure had been dismissed without investigation. Victoria attempted to explain that she had relied on visual inspections and committee recommendations, but the words sounded noticeably weaker than they once had. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody argued. They simply listened, then looked toward the official reports resting on the tables around the room. The contrast spoke for itself. By the end of the meeting, the association board voted to suspend all future property alteration projects involving utility corridors until independent engineering review became mandatory. Additional motions followed requiring public record verification before any enforcement action involving privately owned infrastructure. Watching those votes unfold felt strangely satisfying, not because anyone was losing authority, but because common sense was finally becoming official policy. The old pressure gauge that had dropped to zero on that unforgettable morning was now sitting on my workbench beside the worn pipe wrench my father had once placed in my hands. Both had become reminders that appearances fade, paint peels, and buildings grow old, but careful engineering, patient documentation, and respect for the truth have a way of outlasting every assumption ever made about them. 6 months later, the view from the road looked very different, but not in the way Victoria had imagined. The old weathered shed had been replaced by a reinforced utility building designed to withstand decades of service. Its exterior was clean, simple, and functional, built from reinforced concrete with a steel roof, secure access doors, and modern monitoring equipment connected directly to the county water authority. Around the perimeter stood a modest security fence with clearly marked utility signage instead of decorative landscaping. There were no flower beds, no ornamental stone columns, and no attempt to disguise what the structure really was. For the first time, everyone who drove past understood exactly why it existed. Inside, the familiar rhythm of pumps and pressure regulators had returned. The soft mechanical hum echoed through the building exactly as it had when my father first taught me how to read a pressure gauge. The smell of clean groundwater mixed with fresh concrete instead of old cedar, but the purpose remained unchanged. Water flowed quietly beneath the neighborhood once again, reaching every kitchen sink, every shower, every sprinkler, and every fire hydrant without asking anyone for applause. Daniel Mercer stopped by during the final inspection and handed me the signed completion documents. He smiled, looked around the new control station, and said the county intended to use this project as a training example for future infrastructure protection seminars. He believed the lesson extended far beyond engineering. It demonstrated what could happen when appearances were allowed to outweigh documentation, expertise, and public records. I could not disagree. Over time, neighbors began stopping by for reasons that had nothing to do with complaints. Parents brought curious children who wanted to understand where their water came from. Teachers asked if local students could tour the facility during community education programs. Even some of the homeowners who had once supported removing the old building admitted they had never realized how much invisible work happened beneath their feet every single day. Those conversations mattered more to me than any apology ever could because they meant people were finally paying attention to the things that quietly kept their community alive. As for Victoria, I rarely saw her after the investigation concluded. Life moved on, board members changed, and new policies required professional engineering review before any decision involving utility infrastructure could even reach a vote. The neighborhood became a little slower to judge and a little quicker to ask questions, which felt like real progress. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I still keep my father's old pipe wrench resting on the shelf beside the original pressure gauge that froze at 0 on the day everything changed. Neither tool is useful for daily maintenance anymore, but together they remind me of the lesson he taught all those years ago. People notice water only after it disappears. I would add one more sentence to that now. People also notice the value of quiet work only after they discover how much their lives depended on it. Justice did not arrive through shouting, revenge, or humiliation. It arrived through records carefully preserved, engineering honestly practiced, and truth patiently waiting for the moment when no assumption could stand against it. The little building that so many people dismissed because it looked old never needed to prove its worth. It had been proving it every single day for decades. The only thing that changed was that, at last, everyone else finally saw it too.